It's recording now.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, well, let's make a start. And I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody and thanking you for joining us today. For those of you who haven't attended one of our training sessions, I'll provide a really quick overview of the work that we're doing here. This training programme is part of the Global Peatlands Initiative Research Working Group, which is co-led by Professor Mark Reed at SRUC and Diana Kapansky at UNEP. And the group was established back in 2019, and it really aims to facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration and helps build capacities, identify research priorities, as well as supporting collaboration for national and international research funding for peatlands research. The Research Working Group, as part of their activities, is organising a series of online training sessions to help build capacities, improve and enable interdisciplinary research, and help to advance and harmonise peatlands research approaches across regions, whilst also strengthening that network by inspiring and facilitating impactful collaboration across the peatlands community. The series kicked off in December 2020, and it's continuing into next year and is addressing the core research training needs that have really been identified by our community. So it's a demand-led approach. Today's training, as you know, is about evidence synthesis methods. I'm hosting it. I'm Lindsay Stringer from the University of York. But our key presenter is Leah Barang-Ford, who's based at the University of Leeds in the UK. And Leah holds the Priestley Chair in Climate and Health. Leah's waving now at the Priestley International Centre for Climate, and she's an expert in climate change impacts on health, adaptation to the health effects of climate change, and health benefits of decarbonisation. She was one of the lead authors on the IPCC's 6th assessment report, and she also led the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, which was a huge unpaid voluntary collaboration of more than 125 scientists from around the world who assessed the latest evidence on progress on global adaptation to climate change. Her systematic review, Are We Adapting to Climate Change?, was published in Global Environmental Change and has been really widely cited almost 1,000 times. So that's Leah, and just a bit about me as well. I'm, as I said, Lindsay Stringer, Professor in Environment and Development at the University of York, and also Director of one of the organisers of the training of the York's Environmental Sustainability Institute, YESI. I'm also an IPCC author, as well as an IPBES author, and as well as working in peatlands, I also work in forests, drylands and mountains as well. So I hope everyone's ready and excited about the session. We've got some time for questions at the end, so please do add them in the Q&A box, well, in the chat box. So I don't think we've got a Q&A box today. Add them in the chat box throughout the presentation as they arise, and we'll do our best to go through them. And then once we've gone through those, we can take hands up at the end. Before I hand over to Leah, I'd just like to remind everybody that the session is recorded and we want to put it online afterwards. So if you're not comfortable with that, do let us know in the chat, and also turn your video off as well. Please make sure you're muted throughout unless you're actually invited to speak. I'm going to turn my video off when I hand over to Leah. But yeah, thanks again for joining us today. And I'm just going to try and stop sharing my screen. Give me 1 second. There's too many screens going on here. And I will hand over to Leah.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I will share my screen. All right. Somebody yell at me if you cannot see my introductory slide. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about introduction to systematic evidence synthesis. So I am going to give you a whirlwind introduction. So this is a topic that there are entire modules and courses in. And I'm going to give you basically a whirlwind taste tester to get you familiar with the types of skill sets, types of approaches that are used, and hopefully inspire some of you perhaps to go to learn more or to experiment with these approaches. And yeah, so let's jump right in. I'm going to start with why we even, why we'd be interested in conducting systematic evidence synthesis. So what are the benefits of it? And what do we mean by systematic evidence synthesis, particularly vis-a-vis this kind of common term that we hear, systematic review. And then I'll just walk through all of the different pieces or the different steps of systematic evidence synthesis with examples. And I want to say up front that I think what's important is that you can explore, you can try and be systematic with 1 step, 2 steps. You don't have to do everything. You can begin in the work that you do to integrate systematic approaches into different places in your research. To do every single step that I'm outlining is a huge task, and even standard systematic review expectations don't include every single step. So think about this in taking different toolkits, different pieces that you can maybe begin to engage with over time. Because otherwise I think it can be a bit overwhelming. I'll finish with a few comments on some sort of emerging and new approaches and tools, specifically machine learning, and then end with a few tips and resources. So why conduct systematic evidence synthesis? I think one of the key reasons is to inform policy and assessments. The current system is very much, and this I'm thinking of climate assessments in particular, but this applies in many cases, is that we try to summarize primary research to inform these high-level sort of policy needs, summary and assessments. And there may be a few reviews that we have to work from, but in some cases, we're actually looking at the primary literature to feed into high-level summaries and insights. And that's incredibly difficult as the volume of primary literature increases. And so what we need to move towards is the case where there's not only a culture of primary literature, but there's a culture of evidence synthesis that's available. So when we do these high-level international, national, global, sort of broad assessments, we're not digging into the primary literature, but we're actually able to simply access the synthesis of that literature. So it's really building that middle layer in this pyramid. So the second reason is that a growing literature base means that it's increasingly difficult to reliably synthesize evidence.
Why is it like
I'll keep going. Let me know if there's an important question that wasn't able to be answered there. If we look back,
apologies, I've muted you. You need to unmute.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know what went on there. So if we look back 20 years, we were talking about volumes of literature that were manageable to synthesize. So this is an example, this figure on the right, of the Peatlands literature. So in the year 2000, we had sort of fewer than 200 articles in that year that would need to be synthesized. And not all of them will be relevant to any particular question. That number has multiplied 7 times, so that in 2020, the most recent year that we have a complete literature numbers for, there are close to 1,000 documents. And so we see this trend across many topics, peatland included, climate included, and it's just no longer feasible to reliably say we've looked across the literature and can give you a good representation of what the field and the literature is saying. So when there are reviews, what people end up doing is either they're only looking at a small fraction of the relevant literature just because they're only accessing a few things that they know or whatever's convenient to find, or we're forced to narrow our topic. So we're looking at all relevant literature, but our topic has to be so small in order for it to be manageable. Or we end up with just a biased, non-representative sample of the literature. And so we're getting to the point where a growing literature base means that we have to have a culture of evidence synthesis in order to be able to say that we're making reliable reviews. in many topics. Ooh, I went backwards. Okay. So related to the last point, this is really about if we want to inform policy and practice and we want those recommendations to be evidence-based and reliable. Systematic evidence synthesis allows us to respond for requests for evidence on very specific policy questions. And in doing so, ensuring that we have an unbiased evidence base, that the evidence that we're drawing on isn't just convenience, but we're actually sort of looking in all the corners for relevant evidence. But also that the analysis and synthesis of the evidence is unbiased and robust. So it's not just what evidence we use, but how we analyze that evidence. And then additionally, and this is something I'll talk about a little bit later, is being able to provide confidence in evidence. So this is quite critical in the climate sciences. Even though we don't get it a lot in peer-reviewed review literature, being able to not only comment on results or key insights, but what the confidence is around those key insights based on the evidence is pretty important. And it's something that we don't do a very good job of. And so I would like to fly the flag for and really encourage those of you listening to this seminar to start thinking about engaging in this final area, assessment of confidence. There's an increasing expectation that we're more systematic in the way that we review evidence. These are just a couple sort of high-profile articles that came out over the past decade. Funders are also starting to have this type of expectation, whether it be expecting gap analyses, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, all these different type of vocabulary. There's increasing expectation that the gold standard really will be evidence synthesis that is systematic in some way. And finally, particularly for early career researchers, why conduct this? Well, to gain a new and transferable skill set. It's incredibly valuable to have a skill set and tools for evidence systematic evidence synthesis. This means you could publish papers that might not otherwise be publishable. Many of systematic evidence synthesis papers tend to be highly cited because they're very useful to others. And this is just an example of papers that were published by students or early career researchers in my lab over the last few years. And these are the types of things that might only be a review chapter in a PhD dissertation, but became publishable through more robust methods. So what is systematic evidence synthesis? Well, I'm going to break it down by the words, these three words, systematic evidence and synthesis. Systematic basically means we're applying a rigorous, transparent, and defensible and intentional approach. So essentially, if you imagine a paper that's reviewing the literature, your paper will now have a method section. So we declare what we did, how we did it, why it was done, etc. So it's a review paper with a well-defined and well-justified method section. It's also intentional. So we plan in advance. So it's not just an iterative review, but we do advanced planning to articulate questions, to articulate the methods that will be used. So that's where the term systematic comes in. Evidence. So evidence can be, we typically think of evidence as the literature and the peer-reviewed literature, but really evidence can be many different forms: scientific articles, gray literature, policy documents. While I'm not going to talk about other kinds of evidence, non-literature evidence, you can combine systematic evidence synthesis with expert elicitation, workshops, and other approaches where you think there's evidence that's not in the literature. So this can be combined with sort of these broader evidence synthesis projects, where what I'm talking about today is really talking you through what to do with the literature, but it can be combined with other forms of evidence. If, for example, the question you're asking, the evidence to answer that question might only exist in people's heads, and you need to be interviewing or consulting with people. Some folks that have done systematic evidence synthesis might have a phase where they do this sort of literature review phase and then move on to something like a citizens jury or an experts jury to actually discuss the results from different stakeholder perspectives. So there's a way to merge these pieces. And finally, synthesis. Synthesis is really about these multiple stages of identifying, selecting, collecting, and combining evidence together. And so this is also intentional and strategic, and we also have methods for how we synthesize. So it goes beyond taking the literature, reading it, and summarizing what we think is important, and it's actually taking a more robust and systematic approach to the synthesis stage. So, if you imagine in primary research, we often do literature reviews of the primary literature. Moving forward, systematic evidence synthesis is often sort of a higher level of lit review. So it's sort of a step above a lit review, and we're doing a much more strategic assessment. And then at the highest level, you would have high level policy assessments. So where we need to get to in the field of climate research and peatland research is where high level policy assessments are not trying to synthesize the primary literature, I mentioned this before, but are actually drawing on already mature and robust systematic evidence synthesis literature. So importantly, and this, I'm sort of reiterating what's in this figure here, evidence synthesis is not the same as a literature review. Literature reviews will often review what's in the literature and summarize the key themes in the literature. And evidence synthesis is more strategic, intentional, and directed. So instead of letting the literature guide the results, we take the reins, right, and we ask of the literature a strategic question. And the answer might be that the literature can't answer our question, okay? But the literature doesn't drive the results. The results are driven by the extent to which the literature can answer the question we are asking of it. And the key there is that we are asking a question of the literature. And so we have to sort of articulate a specific objective or policy relevant question that we take to the literature. I want to differentiate systematic evidence synthesis from, for those of you who are aware of systematic review, I want to differentiate it for you. Systematic evidence synthesis, and what I'm talking about today, is really a broad spectrum of different tools we can use to be more systematic in the way we synthesize evidence. One specific type of approach within this broad spectrum is systematic review. It's a much stricter, much more formalized approach with clear guidelines. Okay, so publishing something called a systematic review, there are often very clear expectations and protocols about how you need to do that. And within that, a narrower approach is meta-analysis, where you're doing you're doing quantitative analysis of quantitative analyses. Okay? But what I'm talking about is really the broader umbrella thinking of how we can simply become more systematic with our literature review. So I'm not talking about strict systematic reviews, I'm talking about the bigger picture of systematizing evidence synthesis. And just to give you a sense, this table on the right provides some example of the really diverse vocabulary that's used. So metasynthesis is often used to refer to synthesizing qualitative studies or results from qualitative studies, sometimes mapping and scoping reviews, narrative synthesis. There's a whole lot of messy vocabulary out there. I'm not going to get caught up in it. I'm really exposing you to kind of the big picture ideas around evidence synthesis. Sorry. Yeah, just reiterating what I talked about, there's quite a strictly controlled vocabulary in some disciplines. So using the term systematic review can be quite contentious. So many people, myself included, we'll avoid using the term systematic review unless we're following a clear systematic review guidelines. And so some of those terms are strictly controlled in different disciplines, particularly in health and medicine, but also others. Doing a systematic review can be quite time consuming, and there's kind of clear reporting guidelines, and there are resources which I'll direct you here to. There's this link, evidencesynthesis.org, where you can get some resources if you want to follow guidelines and protocols and do more formal systematic reviews. But normally you want to do a bit more training before you sort of embarked upon this approach. So we'll talk about the bigger picture. So why me? Why am I here? I am the former co-lead for the Campbell Climate Solutions Group. So Campbell is a systematic review collaboration, and we created a specialist group on climate solutions. And so we try and coordinate and facilitate and train the climate research community on high quality evidence synthesis approaches. I also was involved in training some IPCC authors in working group 1 and 2 on evidence synthesis and confidence assessment, and have done various training, particularly in the climate community, as well as advised some funders. This is obviously an old slide because it says DFID, which is now the FCDO. And I also was a board member for environmental research reviews, specifically supporting integration of systematic approaches into that journal, which started asking for systematic approaches for their submitted review articles. And I've published quite a bit in this area as well. All right, so I'll take a breath, and then I'm going to jump into these steps for systematic evidence synthesis. So I've got 7 of them, and I'll go through each of them and just give you a taste of what these different pieces look like. Some of them are mandatory, like the first one, what is your question? Some of them are not mandatory, they're optional. The last one on assessment of confidence and evidence, for example. And so I want to share with you what it might look like to introduce systematic thinking into these different stages of evidence synthesis. So firstly, what is your question? So only a small number or a fairly specific range of questions are suitable to evidence synthesis. So if a question has already been synthesized in the literature, if there's already a really good review, well, then that's not suitable for it to be redone, unless the review was quite some time ago and you're updating it or asking a different question. Some really exciting questions simply need primary literature to answer them. So there has to be literature to synthesize. So this is quite a common mistake, is to try and do a review of literature where there's just no answer and we need primary research on it. Don't use a generic question. So it's much less effective and much less impactful of a paper when we ask questions like, what do we know about? It's much more impactful to ask a very directed question. So tips: do make your question specific and policy relevant. Try and ask a really interesting question that has an answer, that could have an answer to it. And those who specialize in systematic evidence synthesis will actually have an entire phase of a project that stakeholder consultation to identify and articulate the question itself. So you probably want to look to existing assessments, existing literature, et cetera, to articulate exactly what your question is. Look for opportunities where there's a lot of literature, but some of it's contradictory. So you can be answering the question, well, why does this intervention work in one case, but not another? Why do we get this outcome in one case, but not another? Those are particularly well suited. Areas where there's an emerging literature, where there's enough to synthesize, but it's not yet been done, or updating evidence. So if it's been 5-10 years and a lot has happened, we can update that evidence, or we can say this paper asked one question, but they didn't go into detail. Maybe there was a quantitative paper about evaluating an intervention, but you're going to write a qualitative assessment, understanding the mechanisms by which interventions do or don't work, or for whom they work and why. Those are just some tips. So here are some questions to guide you when choosing a question. What are some of the burning questions in my field? Are there topics where there's conflicting literature? Are there studies that review the literature but don't explore the why, for whom, in what context, and what's the heterogeneity, why is there heterogeneity in evidence? Are there reviews that have missed particular sources of evidence? So can you look elsewhere in the gray or the policy literature? Interestingly, we found that sometimes you can get totally different results for the same question based on the literature base you're looking at. So you can do a policy analysis. Is there enough literature to answer this question? Has this question been answered? And is this question answerable? So that's just sort of a reference to guide you. Here's an example. I've got a couple papers by students that I'm going to come back to throughout this seminar, just to give you some walk you through some examples. So in this case, this is a paper done really asking about, in climate assessments, what is the role of Indigenous and local knowledge? Is it important? What is the contribution of Indigenous and local knowledge? And so the review question that was articulated here is, does Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge contribute to improved detection, attribution, monitoring, and surveillance of climate and health data? It's a bit of a mouthful. I chose this because it's a totally qualitative example to show you that these approaches are applicable qualitatively. And this one's also quite interesting because there's a confidence assessment on it. Okay, the second paper example I've got here is the effect of climatic factors on nutrients. So there's the justification here was that there's a lot of literature on how climate will affect productivity and of different agricultural crops, but less so on how climate will affect the quality or the sort of nutrient content of different foods. So wanting to find the literature specifically on that aspect. So in this case, the question was, what is the effect of climate factors on nutrients in food? Okay. So then we move to the next stage where really we're asking the question, where's the evidence base? So we sit down and we say, where can evidence be found? Is it in the peer-reviewed literature, gray literature, policy documents? Maybe the maybe it's actually expert knowledge. You should be able to defend your sources of evidence. So if you are doing a review and you're looking at, and you're missing a core evidence base, then your review will be biased. But it's also okay to be reasonable and say, you know, we think there's important evidence here, but we can't access that evidence for some reason. So here we're just going to be looking at this evidence. As long as you're clear, you admit to the bias, and when you interpret your results, you're honest about the implications of that bias, it's okay not to look at every single gray literature document or not to go into expert knowledge, but you have to recognize those biases and limitations in your work and justify your sources. So you'll want to ask, where does the knowledge reside, to answer my question, and is it accessible to me? If the knowledge is only accessible through primary research, then that's something where there should be primary research, a different type of study. And can I answer my question with this particular source, or do I need to refine my question so it's answerable given the evidence that I have? So the paper on Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. So in this case, when asking about the evidence sources that we can feasibly access and assess, we did not go to the practitioner and knowledge and community knowledge, even though they were really relevant, because these knowledge sources are very difficult to fit into a systematic evidence synthesis using literature. However, different parts of the research project involved participatory research and expert elicitation and collaborative workshops. So we did use that knowledge base, but not for a literature-based evidence synthesis, not for this review paper. Gray literature in this case was very difficult to search for this question because of high heterogeneity and the vastness of the literature. So while that would also be important, we didn't consider it feasible. And so this paper focused on what does the peer-reviewed literature say? Similarly, in this example, this example also focused on the peer-reviewed literature and looked specifically in 3 different databases. So these are both examples focused on the peer-reviewed literature, but there are plenty of cases where we've either combined peer-reviewed and gray literature and policy documents, or just focused on policy documents, or just focused on online gray literature sources. So you can sort of do a combination. So once you've identified where your evidence is, or where generally you're going to find it, you need to access that evidence. And some of the typical approaches are things like keyword searches, where you document your keyword search. You actually have to report retrospectively what your keyword searches were. Or it's also acceptable to do snowballing from key documents. So you either might use key known documents to help validate your keywords, or you actually just start from those documents if there's sort of a core policy report, for example, and look at the references and do forward and backward citation tracking. So you can use snowballing approach, but it should be carefully justified. And it depends on the type of question you ask and the literature that you're seeking to synthesize. So some things to consider for the kind of more robust work. People will do things like selecting 10 to 20 key documents to help them build a vocabulary to use in keyword searches. So I have actually seen somebody do an entire review only to discover that there was already a review on that exact topic, and it's because they missed a critical keyword that was being used in a totally other community of literature. And they didn't think of using that keyword, so they missed out this whole literature that essentially answered their question. That's an extreme example, but the idea of choosing some critical sort of key documents to make sure you're not missing out on important relevant vocabulary. Do lots of test searches to make sure you're capturing relevant literature. You can also separately create a list of 20, 50, depending on numbers, create a list of key documents and see if they're caught in your search. And if they're not, ask, what is it about my search that it's not capturing what I know are key documents? So that's sort of a validation procedure. Sometimes in large literature bases, like gray literature online, there have been techniques like I will review every 10th hit until I get 10 irrelevant hits. So there are sort of protocols you can use to sample really huge literature bases. That's usually only done kind of online and say Google, and it has to be done carefully, but there are kind of ways that we can go about that. So a key question is whether you'll aim to access all possible relevant literature, so every relevant document you want to get. This is generally required in formal review standards, so you should be aiming to get all relevant literature. However, I've also seen articles that aim to access a representative sample. So if they're saying, is this a huge literature, we just want a sample of key trends, I've seen that as well. It's not generally accepted by formal review standards, and it depends on the question. So keyword searches should be transparently documented. They'll often, but not necessarily, include scientific databases like Web of Science or Scopus. if there are specific journals, you could actually identify and focus on specific journals. There are different literature sources that one can search, like Hansard policy documents. Openly going into Google is very difficult. It's difficult to be transparent, and there's a lot there, but it is possible. And then snowballing from key documents. It's not as common, but actually it's pretty reasonable, and can be a good complement. So these are sort of a list of different and potentially complementary approaches you can use to identify your literature. Some extra approaches you can use to help with rigor. Doing test searches. So test out your searches, make sure you're capturing the papers that you do know you should be. I already mentioned 10 to 20 documents and citation tracking. I already mentioned each of these things. So in the case of the paper I mentioned on Indigenous and local knowledge, this is an example of one of the tables in the methods section where the databases that were searched are transparently reported, as well as the exact search strings that were used, so that it's replicable, so that somebody else could read this article, go into the literature, and in theory replicate this search. And this was combined with sort of core scoping criteria. So identifying sort of what was important to find in these documents. And in addition, sort of testing out topic or key terms. So it depends whether you're using, some searches will focus only on title, some will look for key terms as topic. So this is pretty typical to report something like this table here. Once, in theory, you have this big list of data, which often is exported from whatever your online database is, you will have to screen and select which papers are actually relevant, what papers are eligible. And so we create inclusion and exclusion criteria to go through each paper and decide whether it's eligible to be included in the review. And these should be based on the scope and the research questions. So some of the quick and easy ones that you can do right there, usually in the database online, are, restricting year of publication. Maybe you're only looking at the past 5 or 10 years, maybe restricting to just articles, or even there have been review of reviews. So maybe you're only reviewing reviews. Geographical scope, and then some that can't usually be done without actually reviewing at least title and abstract. One might only look at qualitative, or only empirical, or only randomized control trials, as well as focus on key themes. So there'll be a set of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then sorry, I just had a knock on my door. So the exclusion and inclusion criteria are really, really important because they're some of the most difficult, time-consuming, and they'll be important for the scope of your paper. So often what will happen is there'll be a little bit of iterative. You'll discover, oh, there's this whole area, there's all these papers related to this topic I never thought of. I need to adjust my criteria. So often the choice of question, the screening and the searching can be a little bit iterative as you get to know the literature. That's not considered acceptable for purist systematic review approaches where everything has to be a priori and in a protocol. But it's very common when people are not doing pure systematic review. So if the evidence base you realize is turning out to be too large, you can narrow the criteria and the scope. So for example, focusing on peatlands in Northern Europe rather than just Europe, or looking at a specific aspect of peatlands. Similarly, if the scope is too narrow and not many relevant papers are showing up, can widen the scope. So let's look at all peatland policies rather than just one, or let's look at a broader geographic area. So there tends to be this sort of iterative adjustment of the scope as we see how many papers are coming up as relevant. And again, this type of a table is really common. This is from the same paper that I've been talking about. We'll tend to have a list of the inclusion and related exclusion criteria to define how a paper is sort of kicked out or kept in. Here's another example. In this case, there's distinguishing between the criteria that can be used in the keyword search phase, so that's sort of the automated phase, versus the criteria that are applied at the phase of actually reviewing the article, its title, scope, and full text review. And so often you'll do a phase of exclusion with the title and the abstract, for example, and then again you'll go through the full text and you might kind of kick out a few more. So you'll go through multiple phases, starting with what Web of Science or Scopus might be able to do for you, all the way down to what can be done title and abstract, and then some of your inclusion and exclusion won't be possible until you get right down to the nitty-gritty detail of the article or document itself. This figure is a standard figure that's typically also included in the methods, and it basically walks through the process and the numbers of a review. So you might start off with searches and hits with several thousand documents. If you're looking at multiple databases, you'll exclude duplicates, might screen abstracts all the way to full text. Often there might be a quality control stage, or there might be some additional articles coming from snowballing or citation tracking, all the way down to the final number of articles. And the final number of articles can range anywhere between thousands, hundreds of thousands for a machine learning review, all the way down to under 10 for an intensive qualitative review or meta-analysis. So what do you do when you have a list of papers and you need to extract evidence? So some people will stop here. They'll say, we're going to be absolutely systematic about the selection of the evidence, but then when we get the evidence, we're just going to read it and summarize it. Actually, you can and probably should also be systematic about how the evidence is managed and extracted and what you're sort of asking of the literature. Because again, in these systematic evidence synthesis, the literature is just not revealing its insights to you. You're in charge of asking questions of the literature. And how you extract depends on the type of evidence you're synthesizing and what your questions are. So you might be extracting quantitative data estimates. You might have closed questions, so sort of a drop-down option. What continent is this paper about? What ecosystem is this paper talking about? What interventions? What risk factors? A set of closed, restricted options. You might have open questions. What does this paper say are the key drivers of peatland degradation? And you could have thematic analysis, a qualitative thematic analysis, or a mix of the above. So you can imagine that this pile of papers is like, it's a data set, or you're creating a data set from it, and you want to extract pieces of data. If you're a qualitative researcher, you can imagine each of those papers is like a person, and you want to survey them and get information from them. If you're a quantitative researcher, similarly, each of these papers is a unit of analysis or an observation, and you want to extract data. So you're going to create some sort of survey instrument that you're going to use to extract data from each of these pieces of evidence, each of these articles. There are many ways to do it. I'll show you a couple. So some of the guiding questions here, how might you access your evidence? So like, where is your evidence in the paper? What approach, what are you guided by? I really encourage people to find or identify a conceptual, theoretical, or analytic approach to help them come up with the questions they're going to ask, even if it's just a list of overarching questions to help with the data extraction. And, you know, is the key evidence likely to be qualitative or quantitative? Here's an example from the Indigenous and local knowledge paper, where the authors used, and I think they actually created, this sort of conceptual modeling to identify kind of key themes and key areas they were interested in terms of detection, attribution, and action, and used that to create a framework to drive their questions. So it was used to extract information reported in studies, and it was used for qualitative coding and content analysis. So this sort of guided the extraction process. A couple other examples on the left was a framework used in another paper by, I think this is Ford et al., where they used a model of different aspects of vulnerability to basically collect information, went into each paper and looked for evidence where these different aspects of vulnerability had been referred to, or to classify vulnerability across these different pieces. So that was used as a conceptual figure in a review paper. The one on the right is from that large project that Lindsay mentioned, the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, where we articulated a set of 7 high-level research questions and sub-questions within each of those. And for each of those questions, we created sort of, in a sense, a survey instrument around the question. So whether it was just open text response that we were looking for, or whether there was a drop-down choice, or whether it was actually numeric, each of those was a separate question. So it was sort of a survey instrument that we created to take to our literature. A few more examples. This is from students who have basically created I think it was paper in this case, paper questionnaire, where some of the questions are quite basic, obviously, title, year published, and then wanting to do some, this would be considered closed-ended questions. So tick the box, if this is related to private industry, NGOs, different regions. So mostly closed-ended questions, versus here's an example of open-ended questions, where pretty much the entire research was asking these big questions. So in this case, is this particular intervention effective at treating drinking water? And secondly, what are policy recommendations? So you can see there's a pretty big range of how you can design your survey instrument or data extraction tool, whatever we want to call it. So intentionally putting a lot of time into what you want to get from the literature is pretty important and part of being systematic. You can imagine some questions you might ask the literature can't answer, and that's okay, because that's a result unto itself. If there's a question in your survey / data extraction tool that none of the papers answer, well, then you report on that. Or if only a few papers answer, well, then that also affects your results. And that's also interesting. So it's not letting the literature be in charge, you're in charge. And so one of the outcomes of this type of approach over traditional literature reviews is you'll be reporting what the literature does not say, more formally and intentionally. So here's just a few examples on different sort of platforms that are sometimes used to extract evidence. Google Forms, you can create incredibly easily these little kind of survey tools where each article you can fill out and submit, and it'll generate an Excel or a CSV document for you. So it'll automatically generate a spreadsheet of data. Very, very accessible and easy to use and free. SysRev is also free. It's a platform specifically designed for systematic evidence synthesis. You also create a set of questions and you import all your articles into SysRev, and you can have multiple reviewers, and you also get sort of output CSV documents, but there's just a little bit sort of higher level functionality around SysRev. And then finally, some people will just directly enter data into Excel. Each row is a different document. They'll enter, each column is a different piece of information, be it open text and paragraphs, or be it a number and a drop down. So to sort of simply do this straight into Excel, that's another common format. Often evidence is extracted into this type of a format, be it qualitative or quantitative, where you actually have an Excel document. And some of these you can see these are sort of closed options, very specific answers, and others might be full paragraphs in here. Those who are doing fully qualitative analysis might actually put cut and paste key qualitative paragraphs in here, and then do a content analysis from Excel or from a document like this. Quality appraisal is often a key step. It's not always used, but it's often a key step in systematic evidence synthesis. Again, it's a required part of many systematic review protocols. And this is where you're basically taking into consideration the quality of the research in your review. So it could either be a criteria at your inclusion and exclusion stage, where any papers that just don't meet a basic level of quality are excluded and booted out of your review, or papers could be rated during the data extraction phase for their methodological rigor. And then that information can be used to contextualize the results. So you might rely more on papers that were of higher quality, or you might say, well, I found this result, but it was only from a couple papers with low quality. So we're a little less sure about that. This is also really important for because as a first stage for potential confidence assessments. And there are a ton of different tools for doing quality appraisal. This is just one example on the right. But you could just come up with your own quality appraisal and look at a bunch of tools and get ideas of the questions that are asked, like what's the methodological rigor? Does this paper articulate an objective? Are the articles key statements and recommendations justified and clearly aligned with their methods? So it's usually looking at the underlying methodological rigor of a paper. Okay. How will you present your evidence? I think it's always nice in this case to think ahead of how evidence will be presented. I actually like to base most of my systematic evidence synthesis projects on a single table or a single figure that I want to make. I want to be able to sort of summarize. In the case of the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, I wanted a map of the status of adaptation globally. Or I might want a table with key information. So thinking ahead of how you will present your data is helpful in designing your data extraction. I mean, you should sort of almost think about that from the beginning. So how will your results appear in your final report, and then work your way towards that. Don't wait till you have collected a bunch of information you think will be important and then try and figure out what to do with it. decide from the very beginning what these sort of major visual summaries might look like. Here's some examples. You can have figures or graphics. On the left are some sort of basic kind of bean counting figures, you know, how many articles fit into this category, how many articles are from this year or this region. That can also be mapped, how many articles from each region. This is what we call bean counting. It's sort of, it's using number of articles as a proxy for something. So we got to be a bit careful about interpreting that, but there's often a little bit of this in papers. You can also get fancier. On the left, sort of, this is number of articles based on different region and adaptation response. And on the right, it's sort of basically a bunch of different graphics and mapped together. So you can get sort of visually creative about it. It's nice to think ahead of the types of things you might want so that you collect data appropriately to be able to do this. Summary tables are really common, where you're actually listing all of the papers that you reviewed and core information about the papers. We call this table 1 because every evidence synthesis should have some, it's not necessarily table 1, but it should be a core table where you summarize the key evidence based on your objectives by each paper, assuming that your number of papers is small enough to make this feasible. And there's also some papers where you will summarize key findings in a diagram. In this case, they're summarizing kind of the key high-level outcomes in a diagrammatic form, consistent usually with the conceptual approach that they used. Here's another few examples. This table on the bottom was a paper that summarized sort of key themes that arose under adaptation, categories of adaptation, and similarly up here, categories of adaptation and key themes that arose in the literature review around those. This is a paper that was published quite recently as well, and just to show you the range of different visuals and outputs were created in that one paper, all the way from Sankey diagrams to maps, colored tables. There's so many different ways of presenting data from a systematic evidence synthesis. Thinking ahead to what they are will probably allow you to be more creative in how you do it. So yet again, another one, mostly based on tables. So here, describing different policy approaches. Often tables will be linked to the original references that support that. A more detailed description of policy options. And again, here's another Sankey diagram. You have to have a very specific type of data and a large number of articles to pull that off though, so. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about assessment of confidence in evidence. It's not commonly done. People who are used to doing quantitative analysis will be familiar with confidence coming from uncertainty estimates, risk of bias, confidence intervals, that sort of thing. This is different. This is not quantitative uncertainty. This is confidence in evidence. So this is applicable to qualitative data, mixed methods data, or different types of quantitative data. So you might have an uncertainty or an error bar or in a paper around a graph, but if you look at different papers with different quantitative analyses that aren't directly comparable and are of different methodological rigor and different topics, how do you bring that heterogeneity of evidence together and have a high-level confidence assessment? Confidence assessment is really critical for evidence assessments. The climate assessments under the IPCC are a really good example. And despite this, a lot of our reviews and evidence syntheses do not undertake any formal confidence assessment. I would argue they should, and this is kind of one of the really big opportunities I think that's out there for people to grab. It takes a lot more work, but it has really significant value. This is an extraction from the IPCC and how they think of the axes that underpin confidence for them, based around agreement in the evidence base and the sort of rigor of the evidence base. Just to give you an idea of their, that's one example of different axes of evidence to inform confidence assessment. If you've ever seen IPCC reports, and they'll have a statement, and then in brackets they'll say high confidence, very high confidence, low confidence. So that comes, or that's driven by this, that figure, those axes there. So assessment of confidence and evidence occurs after key results. So you get all your key results. You might articulate a list of sort of 5 key statements, and then you undertake confidence assessment on those statements. So the confidence assessment has to be unique to a particular statement. Although you probably want to collect information on methodological quality of the papers in order to allow you to do the confidence assessment. But the confidence assessment comes after you've already got a clearly articulated list of key insights. So you would summarize key findings, whether they be qualitative or quantitative, and for each finding you would undertake a process to put a level of confidence or certainty on that using some sort of framework for confidence assessment. The dominant tool and guidelines on confidence assessment are grading quality of evidence and strength of recommendations. So grade on the left is what's used quantitatively. And I would say people are more familiar with these constructs. So I'm not going to go into these idea of precision, publication bias, risk of bias. What I want to flag, which many people are not familiar with, is that there's a qualitative version of this called grade surqual, which is designed for qualitative results, or I would say mixed methods or heterogeneous evidence, which has a different but related set of criteria where you assess the methodological limitations, coherence, adequacy, and relevance of the evidence base supporting each key finding in order to come out with a confidence grade. And each of these is very clearly sort of articulated, and there's excellent documentation to do this. There's also really, really good online seminars and workshops. I attended one for just an hour and got a huge amount. So if you want exposure to a really new and interesting tool, that's kind of a good use of your time if you can spend an hour to an hour and a half learning about that. This is the kind of thing you get. You would have a summary of each of your key findings from your work, your paper, for example, the studies that provide the evidence to underpin those findings, an assessment of overall confidence, low, medium, or high, and then an explanation. So this would be what would be in your final publication or paper. So you have a confidence rating and explanation around it. And that comes from a more detailed assessment. This might be something in an appendix, where for each review finding, summarize the studies, you assess the broad methodological limitations in those studies, the extent to which the studies are answering questions that are coherent, that are answering actually the questions that you're trying to answer, are adequate in terms of, I'm not going to go into the details of how these are defined, but whether there's sort of a sufficient quality and quantity of evidence, and whether they're actually relevant, whether they're actually on the specific topic. And this is a table sort of summarizing the background work that was done to create the table I showed you in the previous graph. So it's a whole process of systematically assessing the evidence behind your key statements. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about confidence and evidence, although I think it's really exciting, and I do encourage many to sort of explore that further. A couple little comments on emerging tools. I wanted to mention machine learning. It's quite exciting, especially for big literature. If you imagine we've got this explosion of literature, unless we want to keep answering more and more and more narrow questions, or we want to have less robust reviews, we might want to start exploring machine learning, which can't answer every question we want, but it can actually be quite complementary. So this is machine learning uses automated methods to screen and or analyze a vast number of documents. There's a lot of limitations, but it also can be really exciting and complementary, especially when you start with a really huge literature. You want to screen it for sort of core themes, and then maybe you want to do manual or more traditional literature reviews on different themes. Here's some examples of some of the outputs that you can create using these sort of huge data sets. This is from a recent article I did on screening the vast global literature on climate and health, where we can report on where that literature is coming from, what some of the core themes are, what interventions and risks do we have a lot of literature on versus not much, etc. So machine learning was quite useful in this case. And to finish off, my apologies, finishing on a very texty slide, but just some overall tips moving forward. So again, to reiterate, you don't need to do all of these steps, but just think about how you can infuse systematic approaches slowly and increasingly into the work that you do. Choose a step, choose a set of steps, try it out on a paper. If you are a student or if you have students, it's a spectacular way of having a more publishable lit review and kind of picking up a skill while you're at it. Number two, don't use the term systematic review unless you follow formal guidelines. There is a lot of there's a lot of controversy over using that word without fulfilling protocols around it. So it's sort of a word I would stay away from. And then I've been in meetings where there's like quite vociferous arguments about this. So be aware. Be realistic with your ambitions. So there's substantial extra time to do a systematic evidence synthesis over a traditional literature review. So just be aware that if you're going to do this and you want that robustness, it's not easy. It actually does take more work. So be realistic with that. Spend a lot of time during the planning stages because it'll pay off in the long run. But the papers that do come out of this type of work can be highly, highly cited if it's well done and on really big, exciting questions. And the core thing is not only the planning, but choosing a really interesting question. So spend some time on that. Take your question from a sort of a big burning question in the field, whether it be from the IPCC report or other sort of peatland documents, and build an evidence synthesis around that. And seek training. There's a lot of online training. So think of it as something you're building slowly over time. Don't be overwhelmed. You can take kind of one, online workshop, try a few things, etc. So don't be overwhelmed and feel that you have to, do 6 months of a course before you feel comfortable writing a paper. Try one new thing. And again, consider including some form of confidence assessment. These are really, really valuable skills that you can start to pick up moving forward. And with that, I will finish off and we'll have some time for questions. These links, by the way, here are really useful if you are interested in training. The Collaboration for Environmental Evidence has lots of webinars, some journals that actually accepts systematic synthesis papers, and then I've put the software and grade Cirqual where you can get training on confidence assessment. So if you're interested, you can pull some of those as resources moving forward. That's it from me.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Leah, and I'm sure I convey thanks from everybody else that's joined as well. We have got a few questions that have appeared in the chat, which is great. I'll start with one. There's one from Jamie Carr. Is there a rule of thumb around what is a manageable number of hits in the initial searches to be screened per reviewer? So when is the number too large? When should you start to get extra team members and help on board? Is there any guidance around that?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, there is no rule of thumb. If you have a huge team and it's really obvious scanning quickly through titles and abstracts because of your topic, then you can do, tens of thousands. And when we've done really big projects like the global mapping one, we went through really a large number. I mean, I would personally, if it's like just a couple people, I would want it to be in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands myself. And other projects, if it's going to be something where you need to go through the full text and trawl through it, and there's going to be a lot of relevant papers, there's too many factors for there to be a rule of thumb. It depends on how easy it is to screen, the proportion of the hits that you expect to be relevant. So unfortunately, there's not a rule of thumb. I think your instinct will serve you well, testing it out and seeing how well that goes. It tends to be iterative rather than the rule of thumb.
That's great. Hopefully that covers that question. The next one in the chat is from Jen. Could you go into a bit more detail about snowballing?
Yeah, so snowballing is starting with one document, and it could be a couple things. Either asking, depending on how it's defined, you could either ask experts to recommend documents, or you could start with one or a few documents and go through all of their references and sort of work your way through relevant literature that way. It could also be, if you have a couple of papers, a list of key papers, you could look at both what they've referenced, but also some data sets will allow you to look at the papers that reference these key papers. So that's the forward and backward citation tracking. So that can kind of get you much more quickly to relevant results if you're studying a topic that is just sort of a bit unmanageable in terms of there's not really good keywords. So snowballing is sort of using different kinds of convenience approaches to get to relevant literature.
That's great. On your topic of confidence assessment, are there any established approaches to assess the broader generalizability or applicability of the findings to other contexts? So things like locations not covered in the literature encountered.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And that is captured under the criteria. I think it's the relevance one. I think what relevance, if you look into the details of it, is getting at is exactly that. So it'll be if you're interested in global insights, but all of the literature is from North America, you would get a lower score on relevance, and you'd have to declare that these results are less robust, let's say for South America. Or for Europe, and vice versa. If you really want to know about women, but the literature doesn't specify women, you'll have a lower score for relevance, and you'll need to report that there's some literature that's kind of relevant, but it doesn't tell us if this is unique to women. So that will that will come out in that particular criteria, and then you can report on relevance is an issue with this literature, and my results are more or less relevant to these different contexts. So absolutely, yeah.
No, that's great. We've got another question from, it's great, we're getting lots of questions, which is brilliant. Maria, so thank you very much for your advice. This was very informative. Do you have any recommendations for software to create some of the figures or tables for the results sections of the narrative synthesis?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think if you're I think a really nice table is fine and good. Some of those fancier figures I showed you, they were created by, especially in machine learning, they were created by colleagues who are doing, like, using software that I can't use and is inaccessible to most of us unless you actually know coding. If you're a visually inclined person, you can probably pull off at least a conceptual figure and the tables, and maybe do some things in with the basic sort of graphing functions in Excel. The more advanced stuff, either I don't know, or they tend to be a different software, depending on what you're using. So no, I don't have any really secret good insights. When I'm using, when I'm doing graphics, not numeric graphics, but when I'm doing conceptual graphics, I use Canva for visualization myself, which I really like. Certainly the numeric stuff, most of my colleagues will dive into things like R and other stuff. Like the machine learning, I don't even know what they use. They just give me beautiful graphics.
That's good. Yeah, I'm with you with this, Leah. I also leave that to the people that know how to use the fancy software to do do that kind of thing. Chloe's put Miro. Yeah, Miro is also great for visuals as well, as another example. And Kate also said, yeah, Canva can be useful. So that's yeah, that's some insights from the group as well. Thank you for those inputs. Jane, some people have said, is everything going to be shared? Yes, the recording will be put up and shared after the event. Jane's answered that question. Are there any other questions? Because we've answered all the ones that everyone's put in the chat already, but does anyone want to add any more before we wrap up? This is your chance while Leah is here. If there's anything else you want to know or you're wondering about, or any other pointers or questions about the pointers that she's given that you might want a bit more info on? Have you tried using referencing software to manage the results? Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, so typically for a sort of a standard review, yeah, we would export to a referencing software where you can manage the duplicates and the screening. Depending on your analysis, I guess it depends on what type of analysis people want. I mean, if the analysis can be done on information like title, abstract, date, etc., some more bibliometric stuff, or like word searchy stuff, you could even analyze in a reference software. If you have to extract anything sort of qualitative or more complicated from the text, short of text mining yourself, or taking to another software would be harder. But yeah, certainly in handling between the online databases and wherever you're going for analysis, usually those referencing softwares are pretty critical for the screening, the duplicates, all that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you. I sort of skipped that software stage.
Smriti's just put in there, I've heard of people using software like NVivo for their entire literature review. Would something like that work for systematic evidence reviews as well?
So I've never actually worked in NVivo, but I've had a lot of students who have. I know it's quite popular for qualitative analysis. From my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, NVivo is excellent for the analysis stage if you want to do content analysis. But I don't think NVivo manages the screening. That you would have to screen and then import into NVivo. I may be wrong about that, but I think you'd have to somehow screen separately and then do your analysis in NVivo. But yeah, if you're doing a qualitative analysis, sending your articles to NVivo to manage it that way is a good option.
Okay, thank you. There's another one come in. Assuming the time investment to conduct such a review is quite variable, is there any rule of thumb for the time recommendation per article for when you've got a really large literature base? I guess it's a kind of how long is a piece of string type question as well, because it depends how big your big literature base is.
I have seen time estimates out there, but I think it's sort of an average that isn't not applicable to any actual situation. I think the heterogeneity is so high because it depends so much. I mean, it could take 2 hours to do a single article if you're looking for difficult information qualitatively in full text, and it could take 2 minutes if you're looking for something like what are the relevant regions and topics, and it could take, yeah, so there are so many drivers of how much time it takes that unfortunately there really aren't rules of thumb. I have seen reviews done on under 10 papers take the same amount of time as reviews on, you know, several hundred papers. I know it's not helpful to say that, but it really is true. I think rule of thumb, it's more experience and applying that to a specific question to get a sense for it. I know, I get asked these questions a lot, and I always give what feel like unsatisfactory answers.
I might have put thanks, that's what I anticipated. So it's kind of explained. There's another question come up. Is the quality of the journal a good filter for the paper quality? For example, selecting papers only from journals with Q1 or Q2, for example.
I think that's for everyone here to decide, actually. I mean, it's a proxy, whether it's an acceptable proxy. I've never seen it done unless it's an inclusion or exclusion criteria where it's deemed that I've never seen journals applied that way, although I have seen reviews applied to a set of journals. Say we're going to choose key journals in this area and we're going to review those, but that's usually more to have a manageable data set rather than as a quality filter. It's an interesting question. I've just sort of this isn't answering the question, so this is sort of aside. You could actually, if you're doing especially a qualitative analysis, you could have a really poor quality paper, but one part of it is reliable and provides a really nice insight. So for example, a paper that does an analysis, which is just really poor quality, but actually they provide a case study that tells a really interesting narrative that helps explain some explanatory mechanisms for something you want to know about. And that specific piece of evidence is really valuable to you and relevant. And the quality issues with other parts of the paper don't matter. So people even question, so you're asking about whether the journal quality is an acceptable proxy for the paper. I'm actually suggesting even the paper isn't necessarily an acceptable proxy for the quality of the piece of evidence you might want to take from it. So it depends what you want. It's even acceptable to say this paper overall is crap, but actually it has this nugget of something that I think is reliable and really important. So going up and screening by journal for quality feels too high level to me, but if you can justify it, I mean, yeah, I haven't seen it done, but you might be able to get away with it, yeah.
Andreas has just put, I think what's mostly an issue is the expertise needed to assess the quality of the paper. So you need to kind of understand the statistics, the experimental design and the limitations due to pseudo-replication and also misleading claims made in the conclusions that maybe aren't backed up by the results and the data. So having that expertise in the first place to be able to make that assessment is important.
It can be really time consuming. If you do a full, so this is why there are people who their entire expertise is to do these systematic reviews, in many cases, systematic review world, all the way from stakeholder consultation to really carefully articulate the research question through to really intensive methodological and quality control assessment. Like it's sort of multi-year projects, and in the health sciences in particular, you get funding for this as a project. Many people here are probably thinking of this as an add-on to all the other things you do. So scaling it down somewhat, you don't need to understand every single corner of the analysis, but you do need to be able to get some indication of the methodological quality vis-a-vis what you're trying to take from that paper. So you might not need to go into detail. If the detail of understanding the sort of quasi-experimentation, et cetera, matters, you might need a narrower question with fewer papers so you can dedicate that time. So just one thing I didn't talk about, which might be important, is that there is a type of systematic evidence synthesis, which is sometimes called a scoping review or a mapping review, which is just descriptive. So instead of answering a question, it just says, I want to describe the state of the literature, what's out there. And those approaches typically do not do quality appraisal, because they're not trying to come up with the answer to a question, and there's no issue of confidence in evidence. It's just, what is the landscape of evidence? And so there are that side of things, that type scoping or mapping reviews would typically not do quality appraisal. And to be honest, a lot of systematic evidence synthesis doesn't use appraisal. We may think that it should at least have some sort of quality appraisal. And certainly the standardized protocols and guidelines expect that. But many reviews we see out there don't. The bar is low, is I guess what I'm saying. So not to say that the bar is low is a good thing, but the fact that the bar is low means that just doing more, being a little bit more systematic, try it. I think part of the problem is people assume that the bar is so high, they don't even bother trying anything systematic. They imagine, I could never possibly meet these these standards, right? But actually, if you're not publishing a systematic review in the health sciences in journals that have expectations of what that means, then the bar is really low. And it actually isn't that hard to do better. So yeah, I encourage people to try a bit more, to be more systematic. And if that means doing a lighter quality appraisal, that's still maybe better than what you or your students are doing now. So give it a try.
That's great, thank you there. I think we're just running out of time. I've got a few slides that I need to share in a second as well, just before we end, but just like to say thank you again for that really useful synthesis. So if you can stop sharing your screen, I shall start sharing mine again.
Thanks, Lindsay.
So hopefully everyone can see my screen. Don't know if that's working or not. I don't know what you can see. So hopefully you can see a link to a SurveyMonkey feedback form. Is that on the screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, we really appreciate your feedback on this, because as I said at the beginning, it's a community-led training series. So we're interested in what you need to know and what you thought of the training. So if you can provide us with any feedback, that's really, really helpful for us as we move ahead with the programme. Also, in terms of keeping in touch, if you want to look at some of the previous sessions, they're all online. And if you follow the Global Peatlands Initiative on Eventbrite, the forthcoming ones are also online as well. So do sign up if it's interesting for you and you think you might learn some other research skills, whether you're a peatland researcher or not. A lot of these are very generic, but maybe haven't been applied in the peatlands research area so much to date, hence the need for this training. And finally, just to give you a heads up in terms of marking on your calendars, the next session, which is on Monday, the 14th of November, and that one's about communicating complex research simply. So again, another useful session. So I will stop sharing my screen now, if I can get to the right screen to turn the stop sharing off. But it just leaves me to say thanks again to Leah, and thanks to you all for joining once again. It's been really, really helpful. Put the link in the chat. Jane's just put the feedback link in the chat, but as I said, the slides will be shared as well, so hopefully you'll have those to look at as and when you want to go and do your revision of the session, so to say. But we'll end here for now, but thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us in future sessions as well.